My grandfather's hometown was in Ibaraki, Japan. And back in the old days, the burials there were done the traditional way, by placing the dead directly into the earth. The coffins they used weren't like the rectangular wooden boxes we think of today. Instead, they were shaped more like barrels, and the deceased were placed inside in a curled-up sitting position, their knees tucked against their chests. That's how I understand it, at least. The cemetery itself wasn't on solid inland ground. It was tucked away behind a dense thicket of trees just beyond the beach. For years, it sat there quietly, undisturbed, until nature began to reclaim it. Around the mid-1960s, coastal erosion started eating away at the shore, and the waves crept closer and closer to the burial grounds. Each year, the tides came in a little farther, licking at the graves that had once been safe from the sea. By that time, most families had already moved their ancestral graves to safer locations, leaving behind only the lonely, forgotten dead, those whose family lines had disappeared over time. They were the muenbotoke, the abandoned souls, spirits with no descendants to tend to them. Even as the sea swallowed more of the land, no one did anything to protect the remaining graves. Maybe it was because they weren't directly responsible for them, or maybe there was something deeper, an unconscious reluctance to disturb the dead any further. Whatever the reason, the cemetery remained untouched, even as some of the graves started to vanish beneath the tide. It wasn't long before the inevitable happened. The waves began to pull at the soil, carrying it away, grain by grain. As the earth eroded, some of the coffins started surfacing, their lids long since rotted away. Bones, once hidden under layers of earth, were now exposed to the salty air, and when the tide was strong enough, it carried them out to sea. The stretch of coastline had always been dangerous. The waters looked deceptively calm, shallow for a long way out, making it easy for people to wade in with confidence. But then, without warning, the seabed would drop off into a sudden, terrifying depth. The current there was treacherous, strong enough to drag even the most seasoned swimmers out into the abyss, never to return. And of course, you'd have to be brave to swim out there. The murky darkness below hid aquatic creatures with teeth. Local fishermen and villagers had always known better than to swim there. They warned others to stay away, but not everybody listened. The year the bones began to wash away, a typhoon struck. The storm brought towering waves crashing into the already weakened shore. By the time the winds had settled and the waters receded, there was no trace of the cemetery left. Every single grave had been erased by the ocean. After that, strange things started happening. People who lived near the shore reported hearing voices at night, whispers carried out on the wind, hushed conversations in the darkness. Some even claimed to hear someone calling out, "Oi!" a long drawn-out cry, as if someone was searching for something or someone. The villagers who had ignored the problem for so long could no longer turn a blind eye. They decided the abandoned souls needed to be put to rest properly. They needed to be acknowledged, prayed for, honored. And so they built a small shrine on high stilts where the graveyard once had been, hoping it would serve as a place for the spirits to gather and find peace. But by then it was too late. Around that same time, Japan's surfing culture was booming, and groups of thrill-seekers started scouring the coast for new, undiscovered spots with the best waves. That cursed beach, with its strong tides and deadly undercurrents, caught their attention. They had no idea what happened there, no idea what had been lost beneath those waves. One by one, they disappeared. At first, it was written off as bad luck. People underestimated the sea all the time. But then the stories started coming. Surfers who survived spoke of something grabbing at their legs, yanking them downward. Others swore they saw figures standing waist-deep in the water, only to vanish as soon as they looked at them directly. The town tried to put a stop to it. They put up warning signs, banned swimming and surfing, but it didn't matter. Those who came looking for adventure never listened, and so the accidents continued. It was only after the shrine was built and proper offerings were made that things began to quiet down. The voices grew fainter. The disappearances became less frequent. The sea returned to its usual, indifferent self. Still, even today, my cousin tells me that on rare nights, if the wind is just right, you can still hear something out there, low, murmuring voices carried across the water. Not quite words, but not just the sound of the waves either. Something in between. Maybe the spirits of the Muen Botoke finally found some rest. Or maybe, after all those years of being forgotten, they learned to live with being part of the sea. I've always loved scary stories. Ever since I was a kid, I'd collect them like treasures, scribbling down every eerie tale I heard from books, whispered rumors, or late-night conversations in a special notebook. There was something thrilling about the unknown, about the fear that drifted inside you when you truly heard an unsettling story. One day, when I was still in elementary school, a friend told me about a story that people always regretted hearing. He didn't say why. He just said that once you heard it, you wish you never had. Naturally, I was intrigued. Who knows it? I asked. He hesitated before finally saying, "Our teacher might." And that was all I needed to hear. After school, I made my way to the teacher's office and asked him about this rumor. At first, he wouldn't say anything. He dismissed my curiosity with a shake of his head, telling me it was just an old tale. But I didn't give up. I kept pushing, kept pestering him until finally, with a deep sigh, he relented, but only to give me a cryptic hint. When I first transferred to this school, I used to stay late grading papers in the library. But after hearing a certain story about the library, I stopped. Now I only work in the staff room after dark. I leaned in, excited. "Why? What happened?" He looked at me for a long moment before saying, "Something terrifying." And that's all he would say. It was frustrating, but his refusal only made me more determined to find out the truth. Years later, when I was in middle school, I asked an old classmate about the library. He immediately understood what I was talking about. "Oh, that? Yeah, I've heard that story. You know how the library door used to lock only from the outside? They changed it later, so it could be locked from the inside too." "Why?" I frowned. He hesitated for a moment, then he sighed. "Before summer break one year, there was a girl who loved to read. She was always in the library, completely absorbed in her books. One day, the school security guard came to lock up before the break. He checked inside, didn't see anyone, and locked the door from the outside." I felt a prickle of unease. "But she was inside." He nodded. "She was hidden behind one of the bookshelves, lost in her book. She didn't even realize that she'd been locked in until she finished reading and the sun had already begun to set." "Well, what did she do?" "Well, she screamed. She pounded on the door, tried to force it open, but the school was empty, and no one was around to hear her. The next day, her parents reported her missing, but no one thought to check the school. Days passed, weeks. A lump formed in my throat. And then? It wasn't until after summer break that they found her." His voice dropped to a whisper. "The security guard unlocked the door and found her body. She had starved to death." I shivered. The idea of dying like that, alone, afraid, slowly wasting away, was more horrifying than any ghost story. But something was bothering me. "How do you know so much about this?" I asked. He gave me a grim smile. "Because there's more to the story. You know, people don't die right away without food and water, right? That girl, she lasted for days. And you know what she did before she died?" I shook my head, dreading the answer. "She wrote about it. She took the book she was reading and with a pencil scribbled every detail of her suffering between the lines of the words on each page. She wrote of how she realized she was trapped, how she screamed for help, how hunger gnawed at her belly, how she hid from the sunlight in an attempt not to dehydrate, how she begged for someone to find her. I was mortified to hear that. The library closed for a month after they found her. The principal called it an investigation period, but everyone knew the truth. No one wanted to be the first to step inside again. The security guard who locked the door quit shortly after. Some say he moved to another town. Others claim he never forgave himself, that he still visits the school every year on the day she was found, placing a single flower by the library door. I don't know if that part's true, but I do know that the school did its best to erase her. Her desk was removed from the classroom, her name was never spoken again, and when they finally reopened the library, they had gotten rid of every book that had been on the shelf where she had sat last. The strangest part? The school never acknowledged what happened. There was no memorial, no moment of silence, just a prolonged silence. Like they wanted to forget, like they were afraid to remember. And now every time I pass by a library, I wonder how many stories have been erased, how many people have been lost in silence, and how many of them are still waiting to be remembered. It happened about 10 years ago. Back then, I was a burglar. One night, I set my sights on a house in the suburbs of a mid-sized city in western Japan. It was the perfect target. Isolated, quiet at night, with barely any foot traffic. The owner seemed to work night shifts, meaning the house would be empty for hours. A quick in-and-out job, I thought. I watched the house until I saw the owner leave for work. Once the coast was clear, I made my way inside, slipping through a window. I had gotten in and out of people's homes so many times it was easy. I was on autopilot. My plan was simple: grab whatever valuables I could find and get out before anyone noticed. But as I started searching, I heard something. A faint sound, a scratching, gnawing noise coming from deep inside the kitchen. At first I thought it was just a rat. Old houses always had pests. But the sound didn't stop. It got under my skin, the way nails on a chalkboard does. Annoyed, I took out my flashlight and pointed it towards the noise. And that's when I saw it. At first glance, it looked like a dog. Something about its shape, the way it crouched low to the ground. But something was wrong. Its body was pitch black, darker than the shadows, like ink had swallowed it whole. And it wasn't still. Its form shifted, pulsed, writhing, like liquid trapped in a vague canine shape. For a moment I was frozen in place, my muscles locked up, my breath caught in my throat. And then it stopped moving. It turned towards me. It had no eyes, no face, no features at all, yet I felt it staring at me, drilling into my skull. A wave of cold terror crashed over me, my skin breaking into a cold sweat. I didn't think, I just ran. I stumbled through the house, crashed through the door, and back through the window I crept in from, and then I kept running into the night. I should have been safe. I should have left it behind, but I didn't. Because I felt like it followed me. At first, I thought it was just paranoia. Just my mind playing tricks on me, but no, it was real. I started seeing it, just at the edge of my vision. Never fully in sight, but always there. A black shape, shifting, watching. At first it looked like a dog. Then, over time, it changed. One day it almost resembled a raccoon. Another day a cat. Then something that looked eerily human. A child, small and silent, lurking just outside of my line of sight. It's always this pitch black shape, though. And whenever I saw it, there was always a sound. It started with that same gnawing, like teeth, scraping against something hard, but lately it's changed. Now it sounds wet, a sickening, slurping noise, like something chewing, swallowing, feeding. Just 2 nights ago I saw it again, a writhing, inky shape shifting in the corner of my vision, watching, waiting. I don't know what it wants. I don't know when it will come closer, but one thing I do know is, I should have never broken into that house. It happened when I was in my 2nd year of middle school. The old wooden clubhouse we had been using for years was scheduled to be torn down. It was the first day of summer break, and after our morning practice we were assigned to clear everything out. Lockers, equipment, and supplies were hauled out, over to the newly built clubhouse, leaving the old room empty and lifeless for the first time in years. That's when one of my friends called out, "Hey, check this out!" He was pointing at the wall where a row of lockers had been. Now that they were gone, we could see a wooden panel nailed to the wall. It looked out of place, different from the rest of the wall, almost like an afterthought. Curious, we knocked on it. The sound was hollow. "There's something behind there." We all knew that the school bathrooms were on the other side of this wall, so at first we assumed that it was just an old maintenance panel or a storage space. But the hollow echo had us all intrigued. We grabbed a metal pipe, then a pickaxe, prying and smashing at the wood until finally a section broke away. It wasn't the bathroom. Behind the panel was a narrow, pitch-black space about 3 meters deep and barely a meter wide. It had no floorboards, no windows, nothing but raw earth. The ground sloped down steeply, vanishing into the darkness. A damp, musty smell drifted up, mixed with something fouler. The stench of rot, sewage, and old mildew. Maybe because it was right next to the bathroom. But the air in there felt stale. Like it hadn't been disturbed in years. Without hesitation, the 3 of us climbed down into the space. I definitely wouldn't have done that these days, but back then when we were young, we were fearless, or maybe just dumb. Our shoes crunched against the loose dirt as we moved deeper in. The walls were rough, uneven, just packed dirt. As we reached the end of the sloping passage, we realized something. There was a hole in the ground. It was about 50 centimeters wide, just large enough for a person to crawl through. It looked unnatural. The shape was too perfect, like it had been dug out deliberately. I crouched down and peered inside, my breath echoing back at me from the darkness. It was impossible to see anything. I was about to say something when my friend nudged me. "Go get a flashlight." Excited, I scrambled back up, out of the hidden space, running across the schoolyard. I lied to a teacher about needing it for cleaning, and then snatched a flashlight from the supply room before dashing back. But when I got back to the hidden passage, my friends were gone. The air inside was heavy, and the dim light from the gap in the clubhouse barely reached down into that hollow space. I hesitated at the edge of the slope, trying to see into the darkness below. "Hey, where are you guys?" I called out. Silence, then softly from the blackness, "Bye-bye." A girl's voice, cold, clear, and far too close. My heart stopped. My skin erupted into goosebumps. I didn't think. I bolted out of there, nearly tripping as I scrambled back into the sunlight. My legs carried me towards the new clubhouse where a group of students had gathered. In the center of that group were my 2 friends. They were sitting on the ground, their faces pale, eyes wide. Their hands were scratched up, their knees covered in dirt. "What the hell happened?" I gasped. One of them, still shaken, spoke up. "After you left, I pulled out my keychain. You know, the one with the tiny red light? I used it to shine into the hole, just to see if there was anything there. He swallowed hard, gripping his arms. And there was a face. A face? A woman's face. Pale, smooth, no hair, no expression. Like a mannequin, but it wasn't a mannequin, man. It moved. I saw its hands, long, thin fingers pulling itself forward. The other friend nodded, his voice trembling. And that's when we heard it. Heard what? The laughing. From behind us. Oh, that made a chill run down my spine. We freaked out, we ran, slipped down the slope, scratched ourselves up, just got the hell out of there. I looked at them both, waiting for more, but that was it. They had nothing else to say. Neither of us ever saw anything again. No ghostly figures, no strange voices, nothing came for us in our sleep, like in the movies, and nothing followed us home. But the story doesn't end there. Later, when construction workers came to demolish the clubhouse, they found the hole behind the wall. Out of curiosity, they decided to dig deeper. What they found was an old underground chamber. Maybe it was an old air raid shelter. Maybe it was an animal den. But there was no record of it anywhere. No one knew who had dug it, or when, or why it had been sealed off. They covered it back up, filled it in, and now, the place is just an empty lot. But sometimes, someone still leaves flowers there, for reasons unknown to me. Back when I was a student, I worked part-time at a well-known chain bar. It was one of those businesses that prioritized profits over everything else, cutting corners wherever possible. When they expanded into rural areas, they often used the cheapest buildings they could find, even if they weren't in the best condition. The location I worked at had hardly been open for about 10 years by the time I started. It was an old building, and sometimes at night, we'd hear strange rustling sounds coming from above. One evening, the assistant manager and I decided to check it out. We dragged a ladder over, broke the lock on a small ceiling door, and peered inside. What we found was unsettling. The attic space was about 6 tatami mats in size. Inside there were these dusty old bottles of alcohol, a small altar of some sort, and an old notebook. The bar's second floor had a large banquet hall, and from there you could see the building's roof through a high window. I'd always wondered why there was a set of double doors there, like the kind you'd see on a traditional storehouse when there was no visible room behind them. Now I understood. The attic had been hidden away for years. As I was looking around, the assistant manager picked up the notebook, flipped it open, and then immediately went pale. Without saying a word, he climbed down, rushing out, and returned with a new lock. He scaled the door, shut it, and told me in a hushed voice, "Don't go up there again." That notebook wasn't just any old notebook. It was a mother's handbook, a maternity record. At the time I didn't fully understand what it meant, but later I heard rumors. According to the landlord, the building used to be a grand estate, owned by an extremely wealthy family in the area. And that attic, it wasn't just for storage. It was a room for confinement. What or who had been locked away up there? I didn't ask. I didn't want to know. A month later, the assistant manager disappeared. No one could get in touch with him. The company had a high turnover, and people walking out without notice wasn't unusual. No one really questioned it. But I did. Even now, I still wonder about that attic, about that notebook, about those rustling sounds in the ceiling. And what happens to those who look too closely at things that were meant to stay hidden? Some memories don't fade with time. They sit in the back of your mind, unnoticed for years, until something, an old photo, a familiar scent, a stray thought, brings them rushing back, demanding attention. This is one of those memories. It isn't just a scary story. Maybe it isn't even a ghost story. But it is unsettling. And I can't explain it. No one ever talks about it. And that, more than anything, makes me question if it ever really happened. When I was a kid, my mother and I had a yearly tradition. We would take a night bus from our city, where snow never fell, all the way to Nagano. We'd check into a hotel, get some rest, and then spend the entire day at the ski resort. It was one of my favorite times of the year. The slopes were always packed with people. The cold air was filled with the sound of laughter and cheerful music played from hidden speakers along the lifts and rest areas. It was loud, bright, full of energy, the kind of place where nothing but good memories were made. So I thought. That particular year, I remember skiing down one of the easier slopes when something unusual caught my eye. A mangled, broken sled, half buried in the snow, near the base of a snow-covered hill. It was the bright orange plastic kind, the kind I've seen parents using to pull their toddlers along the gentler slopes. I'd noticed a few families using similar sleds earlier that day. Their kids bundled up in thick snowsuits, giggling as they were being towed behind their parents. At first I thought nothing of it. Accidents happen all the time at ski resorts. People fall, equipment breaks. But as I got closer, I noticed something strange. Through my tinted goggles, I could make out faint specks of red scattered in the snow around the wreckage. My stomach tightened. It wasn't until I lifted my goggles that I saw the color clearly. Deep, stark red against the white snow. That made my breath get caught in my throat. It was blood, not a little. Not just a scratch or a nosebleed, more than there should have been. Curious and unsettled, I followed the trail of red droplets. They led me away from the busy slopes, past clusters of skiers who seemed oblivious to what I was seeing. The blood continued in a broken, uneven path, leading all the way to a small, dimly lit wash station used for cleaning skiing gear. And that's where it stopped. The wash station floor was covered in blood. It pooled along the tiles, smeared in frantic, erratic patterns, as if someone had tried desperately to scrub it away, but failed. It dripped from the metal grates over the drains, fresh enough that it hadn't frozen in the cold air. The sheer amount of it made my knees go weak. It was so much, too much for a simple accident. Too much for anyone to have walked away from unscathed. I wasn't alone. People were walking past, some right by the entrance, even a few stepping around the stained floor. But no one reacted. No one stopped. No one even glanced down. It was as if I was the only one who could see it. I looked around, searching for a face reacting to what I was seeing, for someone who might acknowledge what I was seeing, but there was nothing. Just strangers chatting, laughing, hurrying back to the slopes like everything was fine. I don't remember how long I stood there, my breath clouding in the cold air, my fingers stiff in my gloves. But eventually I turned and walked away. I didn't tell my mother. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't know how to explain what I had seen, or worse, why no one else seemed to notice it at all. We never went skiing again after that. Not once. My mother never asked why I stopped wanting to go, and I never volunteered an explanation. But sometimes late at night, I wonder if she remembers something too. If she saw something that day and decided, just like me, never to speak about it. If that's the case, why? Why the silence? Was it just my imagination? A child's misunderstanding of something routine and explainable? Or was there something else at work? Something stranger? A glitch in the fabric of reality? A moment I wasn't supposed to witness? Maybe I saw something that happened in the past that somehow appeared that day. Or did I, just for one brief instant, step outside the normal world and into something much darker? I'll never know, but I can't help but think about it.